Archiving started.
Hello and welcome to our first of 3 lectures on Kantian Deontology. Kantian Deontology is going to be a harder ethical theory than the ones that we've previously looked at thus far, for many reasons. Many of these many of the reasons here relate significantly to the originator of this theory, Immanuel Kant. Immanuel Kant was a Prussian philosopher who practiced primarily in the late 18th century, after he was awakened from his, quote, dogmatic slumber, end quote, by his readings of a Scottish philosopher by the name of David Hume. We'll return a little bit to David Hume later in the semester. But Kant, as an enlightened philosopher, focuses significantly upon the ways in which reason can be used to ultimately know things about the world. Kant is a monumental figure within the history of philosophy, and wrote on a wide range of different ideas, including political philosophy, epistemology, metaphysics, ethics, aesthetics, and so forth. His work is known for being particularly dense and difficult to manage. There are going to be times during these lectures when you feel significant confusion about Kant. Don't worry, this is very, very normal for students who are first approaching Kant. I highly recommend that you not only pay attention to this lecture, but also read the supplemental material regarding the various topics that we discuss associated with Kantian Deontology, as well as reading your text. It's going to be remarkably important, because Kant, dense though he may be, is an absolute giant in philosophy. So let's take a look at the structure of the theory. Kant's theory of the right is this unusual thing he calls the categorical imperative. Now, we're going to get really deep into the categorical imperative, and we're going to see that Kant himself ends up offering 2 versions of the categorical imperative, which he ultimately argues are the same thing. A lot of debate exists within even contemporary philosophy as to whether or not this was indeed the case. Kant's theory of the good is going to relate back to something that he believes is essential to us as humans. Now, he's not talking about our human nature or anything such as that. What instead he talks about is our rational nature, the fact that we as creatures have rationality. Now, this is a remarkably Enlightenment idea. Now, according to Kant, because we have rational nature, we have dignity. Again, he sees these 2 things as being the same thing. And ultimately, what ends up leading to giving us that is our intrinsic good with Kant, and that's autonomy. We'll also approach this topic as well. Now, for Kant, this is going to be one of the first philosophers where the moral value of an agent is particularly important. Kant believes that we can only be praised or blamed for our actions depending upon our motives for our action. So he believes, for example, that we can be praised only if we are acting from the sole motive of duty. We're going to see where that may be appealing to some extent, but also could lead to a lot of problems. Our theory in a nutshell, well, to be honest, is a little incomplete at this point. Our first version of the categorical imperative is going to say that an action is right if and only if failing to perform it would fail to respect humanity. Being able to respect humanity is very important for Kant, and he has a certain idea of how we should respect humanity. Obviously, we're going to continue to revise this idea. Again, his theory of the good is that rational nature, which he calls dignity, is an end in itself and thus has unconditional intrinsic worth. Now, Kant, as a deontologist, is focused on actions, on what makes something right. And in particular, what Kant wants to make sense of is our everyday sense of duty. Duty is an unusual idea when we kind of break it down. It seems so easy. It seems like, well, I have a duty to do certain things. I have certain obligations. If I have an obligation, I have a duty to fulfill that obligation. Well, Kant wants to argue that this is a really muddy idea, and we need to get really deep into it in order to truly understand it. Kant believes that moral obligations have to exist equally for all rational agents, not just for humans. So, like we saw in utilitarianism, this theory, presumably, is going to be more universal. In fact, to any type of entity that may have rational nature, may have rationality. Now, Kant believes that morality is grounded, it must be grounded in something that gives it absolute necessity. And he sees this absolute necessity, again, coming out of pure reason. Now, Kant argues that there are two types of reason. The first being practical reasons, which deal with our capacity to deliberate and make free choice. We have reasons to do different things. Sometimes these are remarkably practical. My reason to walk my dog, for example, is because my dog has indicated that she needs to use the restroom. So I may have a practical decision-making procedure that goes into play, which allows me to do such things. Come to such decisions, that is. Theoretical reasons deal with how we use reason to develop rational beliefs about how things really are. Again, Kant is representing here a type of synthesis that we didn't see previously in modern philosophical thinking. That is, Kant is looking at the way in which rationality and rationalism works with empiricism. That is, how we can know things about the world through not only our senses, but also through our thoughts. Previous philosophers largely focused on one thing or the other. And so there's a long debate with regards to the nature, for example, of substance and so forth within modern philosophy, whether or not it was real, whether it was ideal, what was the thing that underlied everything, and so forth. Well, Kant believes that ultimately rationality and empiricism can help give us those answers. Kant is going to make an assumption here that states that rationality is a universal standard for morality. Kant does not believe that we can be moral agents without being rational agents. So when we look at practical reason, Kant believes that practical reasons lead us to things we call categorical imperatives. Now, notice here this is small c, small I. These are unconditional demands, which ultimately derive from the categorical imperative, or big C, big I. You see some of the problems here with Kant being rather dense in terms of reading. Moral reasons are unconditional. That is, whenever we have a moral reason to do something, we have to do it. There is no exception to the rule. Non-moral requirements involve what Kant believes is a means-end form of reasoning, which he calls a hypothetical imperative. A hypothetical imperative is vastly different than a categorical imperative. A hypothetical imperative states something along the lines of this. If you intend to get an A in this class, you ought to take notes, ask questions, complete the assignments, or else you should give up the goal of getting an A. So it may be able to say that a hypothetical imperative has a particular kind of formula. If you intend to do something and realize that you have to do something else to make it happen, then do it or give up the goal. Hypothetical reasoning, or hypothetical imperatives, relate to specific goals. Therefore, we might say that they are conditionally valid for agents. My goal may be completely different than your goal. And as such, we could say that a hypothetical imperative doesn't maybe give me enough of a grounding for some type of universal morality. After all, if I'm going to say that morality is dependent upon the individual agents, then I'm back to solipsism, or a radical form of individualistic moral relativism. Kant clearly rejects this. Kant believes that moral requirements are unconditionally valid expressions of practical rationality. So we're going to reject a hypothetical imperative as being the basis for any type of morality. So let's talk about the categorical imperative itself. Again, Kant believes that for a moral requirement to be unconditional, it has to deal with something that is unconditionally worthy. That is, something that has intrinsic worth. Kant describes these things as ends in themselves, or an end in itself. This is something that has unconditional intrinsic worth. Now, you may notice here that this idea of something having an end in itself seems to approach some of the ideas that we saw in Aristotle as well, when he talked about functioning and functionality as defining the essence of something. Kant is kind of following the same path here. So, if a moral requirement has to deal with something of unconditional worth or value in order to be unconditionally valid, we got to figure out what this is. What is this thing that is an end in itself? Kant believes that rational nature is an end in itself. And again, he confuses us even further by calling this dignity. So remember, rational nature equals dignity. Very basic formula here. If this is indeed the case, and Kant believes that he conclusively shows this within several of his works, including the groundwork toward the metaphysics of morals, and some of his work on practical reasoning, he believes that rational nature must be the foundation, or can be a foundation, for the supreme principle of morality. Furthermore, Kant believes that when we have rationality, we also have autonomy. To be an autonomous agent basically means that we have the freedom to make choices. That is, that we can make uncoerced choices that are based solely out of reason, that are not dependent upon desire, i.e., things such as emotion. Kant believes that autonomy is the ground for dignity for all rational agents. So therefore, autonomy is going to be an essential feature of that rational moral agent for Kant. He tells us, our rational nature makes us ends in ourselves because we have autonomy. We possess this status because, again, we possess autonomy. Therefore, our nature as autonomous agents makes us ends in ourselves, and anything with the status of an end in itself has unconditional value. Now notice what Kant's doing here. Kant is now beginning to build his theory of morality. He's established that autonomy is the sole intrinsic good. And if things have autonomy, have rational nature, and rational nature is an end in itself, we may be able to go ahead and logically extend that says that autonomous agents are ends in themselves, which means autonomous agents are worthy. That is, that they have unconditional value. So let's go further. Our autonomous rational natures have unconditional value. If something has unconditional value, then there is an unconditional requirement to respect it. Therefore, there is a basic unconditional requirement to respect the autonomy of agents. Notice here that we're beginning to build, again, towards a particular idea of how we should relate to one another. When agents who are autonomous relate to one another, Kant is telling us that respect has to be at the foundation of that relationship. And that leads us to the first formulation of the categorical imperative. We call this the humanity as an end in itself formulation. So act that you use humanity, whether in your own person or in the person of any other, always at the same time as an end, never merely as a means. This is pretty huge. Think about what he's telling us here. Kant is telling us that whenever we relate to another person, that we have to fundamentally respect that person in themselves, and that any type of instrumental usage of the person that would fail to respect that person's autonomy, that is, that would coerce them, for example, or manipulate them into doing something that we want, is immoral. We have to respect the fact that other people make decisions, that they have the freedom of choice to do so. If we only treated them instrumentally, we're acting immorally. This is going to have some pretty major implications for Kant's ideas. Well, from this, Kant can derive a system of duties, all from this categorical imperative. So let's imagine, for example, a top-down chart. You see one noted, for example, in your book from Timmins. Kant believes that there are two general categories of duties that can be derived from the categorical imperative. These include the duty of self-perfection and the duty to promote the happiness of others. These duties constrain our actions. That is, that they end up providing the basis for which we can say why we should or should not do certain things. If you look on page 159 and 161 in Moral Theory, you'll see Timmins' figures where he details some of the duties to oneself regarding self-perfection and duties to others regarding their happiness. Now notice here that he breaks this down into to duties that we have because we're moral agents, and to duties we have simply because we are natural beings. And he talks about duties of omission and commission. Well, a duty of omission is a perfect or narrow duty. That is, a duty of omission is going to tell us not to do something. Now, when I have a prohibition that tells me not to do something, I have no real flexibility, that is. I'm simply told this action is prohibited. Therefore, we're going to call it really narrow. That is, it's going to give me a specific thing that I should not do. This is different from a duty of commission. These are imperfect, or what he calls wide duties. These allow us to have a lot more flexibility. So, for example, if you look at the duties for self-perfection, with regards to duties of commission, we have a duty as a natural being to develop our natural powers of spirit, soul, and body. And we have, as a rational agent, as a moral agent that is, the duty to develop our moral powers, to develop our ability to morally think. Notice here that we don't have a lot of guidelines necessarily for what to do, but he's telling us that we should do certain things. Not that we should avoid certain things, but that we should do certain things. Another important distinction there. What we should not do versus what we should. Again, our duties of self-perfection were evaluated as a natural and as a moral being. The thought of duty is our sole motive for action in this situation, or under these duties. We'll come back to this idea in another lecture. When we discuss the duties to the happiness of others, these evaluations are based on love and respect. Now, it's interesting to note that we do not owe love to other people, but according to Kant, we do owe respect. Now, another thing that's important to note here, too, which is a major difference from consequentialism, is that we don't have a duty to promote our own happiness. We have a duty to promote our self-perfection, but not our own happiness. Actions whose performance would interfere with someone's humanity violate perfect duty. So, for example, if I act in a way that's envious of another person, then I'm acting in such a way that I'm not respecting their autonomy. We would say that that would violate perfect duty, because I have a duty to not be envious of others. Actions whose performance would fail to promote or respect humanity violate or do not fulfill imperfect duty. So again, if I fail to respect a person's humanity, so for example, if I was to use somebody instrumentally, then I've ultimately engaged in an action which doesn't end up promoting their humanity, clearly. So we may be able to look at this kind of general diagram to show us how this may develop. The categorical imperative is our supreme principle of morality. From that, we can derive two different types of duties. Again, the duties to adopt our own perfection as an end, and the general duty to adopt others' happiness as an end. We develop systems of duties to ourselves and systems of duties to others, and then we can bring it down to specific situations where we have duties to ourselves and to others. Now, if you thought that was complex, just wait till you see what happens in our next lecture.